The weather is better, and I am once again outside. I have finished the first book in Roger's Cheap Old Book Club, which that is the reading challenge that I was doing this year. Mainly because he started in February, which was a little more ideal for me. And these are all older books and kind of up my alley. And there was a little less pressure than some of the other book reading challenges. So the first book, the February book that I finished, was The Prisoner of Zenda by Anthony Hope. This is a book that I have heard of before, mainly because it sounded like a video game. And I always would get the two things kind of confused when I was younger, when there were the whole Legend of Zelda going on. But this is The Prisoner of Zenda. This was the beginning of a whole genre of books in this, I forget what year this was, in this time period that was kind of these, 1894, kind of these Ruritanian adventure stories. I can see why they appealed. They were basically about a fictional country in Europe that somebody would get sort of tied up in all the different sort of political and adventurous shenanigans that were going on in that fictitious country. Because this one is about this country called Ruritania, I guess it's pronounced, that the main gist is this guy named Rudolph. He's kind of a ne'er-do-well of sorts. His sister-in-law is always after him because he's not making anything of his life, and she just kind of thinks he sits around and does nothing. They're from a fairly wealthy family. He sort of starts the whole thing out because he looks like, well, there is a trait in their family that looks like the ruling family of this country called Ruritania. And that is because one of generations back, one of the kings of Ruritania had a clandestine affair with one of their ancestors, and lo and behold, her kid came out looking mighty like the king of Ruritania, and then they just kind of went on not mentioning this in the family line. Well, Rudolph happens to have this trait. It's basically his red hair and certain features in a face, and a nose. I believe it's the nose, too. So he has these features, and his sister-in-law is always like, that's so uncouth, and, that it's a reminder that their family kind of had some less than above-board background with everything. So he decides that he is going to get out of her hair by going and traveling to Ruritania and have a little bit of a kind of adventure around the country. He gets there, runs into the crown prince, who is about to become king. That crown prince, the country doesn't know him very well because he sort of like spent his whole youth and everything abroad and not really interested in affairs of the country. So he is kind of a ne'er-do-well as well, and he and Rudolph run into each other and marvel about the fact they're kind of like spitting images of each other. They literally are mirror images. And then they talk about this is where we kind of get into the Prince and the Pauper type of a deal, because they're talking about him being crowned king, and all of a sudden they kind of have a drinking evening, and the king ends up like really, really knocked out in the morning. And so the guards and the kind of the close advisors to the king are like, okay, come on, you've got to step in for the king, so we can't look bad, because the king's brother, who is kind of his illegitimate brother named Black Michael, is trying to weasel his way into the throne. So they get Rudolph. He's like, okay, fine, I'll stand in for him for this one thing. When they get back from that day, the king is gone. He has been kidnapped. Black Michael has him, and he has him locked up in this castle Zenda. And now Rudolph is stuck having to pretend that he is the king, or yeah, I guess he's crowned king at that point. Having to pretend he is the king while trying to get the actual king out of the castle and get through this whole plot that Black Michael has made here. He also is very much in love with the king's fiancee, Princess Flavia, which is quite the name. With their, every time I read it, I was like, Princess Flavo Flavia. He is absolutely in love with her, but he knows that this is doomed because eventually the hope is they will get the king back in and he will marry her or have to marry her, and this whole ordeal. Now, there are some things that I really do like in this. This book does not slow down for anything. It just launches into the actual plot and keeps on going. It's only like 120 some odd pages anyway. So we are going through adventure at breakneck speed. I can understand why we made movies of this one, because it is just absolutely breakneck speed. You have the sort of doomed love affair that he and Flavo Flavia will always love each other but cannot be together because she has to do her duty as queen and he has to basically step aside and let the king come back and rule the country. You've got sort of this fallen woman of sorts named Antoinette, I think, or Antoine. But she is Black Michael's sort of paramour, and she doesn't like the fact she's all messed up in this plot, but she still loves him, so there is that complication happening. And then you have, basically to the last third of the book, Anthony Hope adds this other character who, and God love him, he loved the R names too. There's a Rudolph and a Rupert, and there's all sorts of these R names. That is sometimes kind of difficult to try to make sure everybody, Ruritania, trying to keep everybody apart for all of this, because there are lots and lots of R names and lots of made-up Middle European names that I guarantee are not from any country. Some of the names of these cities is just like alphabet soup, what they're trying to do. But anyway, he introduces this one character about 2/3 of the way through that I consider much more the antagonist than Black Michael. Black Michael kind of does all this plotting and planning, and he's the one who ultimately is like after the king's throne. The real villain is this character named Rupert Hentzau, because Rupert Hentzau it's the first time I've ever read an older book like this that describes the villain as just drop dead hot. Like this villain, somehow Anthony Hope, I think, understood the appeal of villains to some degree. This Rupert Hentzau is just repeatedly described by everyone as he is like the hottest guy that has ever crossed anyone's eyes, and he is just a complete and utter bastard. He betrays everybody with a smile. He's not even sneaky about it. He's one of those like brave villains that just sort of plunges in and has this like incredible amount of luck and just sort of cavalierness about everything. He is that type of a villain. He would have a massive fan following today if he was in a movie, because he is just charismatic as all get out and hot, and just everybody loves him because he, not loves him, but they do have this like healthy respect for him, and the ladies are all like, ooh, he's good looking every time, and the guys are like, he's so good looking every time he goes across. Everybody mentions that. That's the funny part. But there is so much, he's a different, normally when you see books back in the late 1800s, when they describe a villain, they describe them like Black Michael, where they talk, they've always look surly, they, have all these dark features a lot of times because they're always looking brooding and this and that. And that is Black Michael, who you would think, honestly, is the antagonist for most of it, and he is kind of, but then like 2/3 of the way through, it flips, and the main antagonist is Rupert. It's so much so, he doesn't even get it in the end. He gets away to set up a sequel, you can tell. He just sort of cavalierly steals a horse and is like, see y'all, and rides off into the sunset. Even though he has kind of caused the most upset out of all the antagonists, because there's several. in here. So, yeah, it's kind of a funny way to do a villain. I have not seen a villain this way before, and it's also sort of shocking because he just pops up randomly. It's just like all of a sudden he's there 2/3 of the way through the book, and he just arrives and takes over. And you really don't care much about Black Michael becomes a secondary villain from there on out. It's very clearly he's outmatched by Rupert, who's also sort of scheming his own stuff by that point. And Rudolph is then trying to deal with Black Michael's ultimate scheme, and then also trying to deal with Rupert, who is just kind of a different. He's a wild card. He is just a loose cannon about everything he does. He is the Loki of this adventure. It is just absolutely cavalier. He is a chaotic man. He is just pure chaos wherever he goes. So very, it's an interesting book. I don't necessarily. It's very much a commentary on the ideas of women at the time, based on the fact that he repeatedly is making comments about the fact that how can woman is fickle and all this sort of stuff, and how can we trust so and so, and women will forget what she's doing, and da da da. There's a lot of that happening in here, which is just sort of eye rolling, and painfully cringe inducing. Through a lot of this, because it is a lot of the masculine trope of the poor little woman who doesn't know how to do anything. With all of this, even though he's repeatedly talking about Flavor Flavia is like going to be kind of the people all love her, so she's like sort of the main gambit in keeping the people behind this Ruritanian throne and everything. So even while you're talking about that and how much he loves her and blah blah blah, he still very kind of dismissively treats her like a little girl almost, even though she could have his head chopped off in 5 seconds if she figured out anything. He talks about the one who's mixed up with Black Michael as her being, forgetful and blah blah blah, fickle and blah 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 blah, whereas she's actually the one who goes and does something later on and actually is kind of the reason they're able to get a plan in place. So ultimately you have this situation where he's dismissively talking about the women, but also the women are the sort of catalysts of different things. So it's very arguing against itself sometimes. But this is something that could have a modern rewrite. I could see this easily having a modern rewrite of some sort and getting a little more up to date and doing something different with this plot. If it is on Gutenberg Press, which I believe all the ones from Roger's Cheap Old Book Club are, that means I believe it probably is in the public domain. So, somebody maybe should do something with this sort of plot type, because I could see it working if it was just modernized a little bit. But this one, not a bad book. This one, for starting out the old cheap book club, it's a good one to start out with, because it was fast read, fun. You could keep up with it pretty easily, and there wasn't a lot of there's no dead time in it. This is just constant stuff constantly happening, for one thing after the other. So this was the February Cheap Old Book Club book choice here, and probably give it about 4 out of 5 stars, and just that it's very readable. I believe we actually had a copy of this when I got into the library that I'm in right now. We had a copy of this. It was very, very old and very, very beat up, and I had to weed it because it was there was no interest. The kids were not going to pick it up, obviously, because there was no interest. They did not know what this book was, did not know anything. Still not sure a kid would pick this up, just because of the sort of fashion of everything. Not sure, but it is of an older book, much more readable, I think, than a lot of them are. So I moved on to Forgotten Planet, which is the March book. Very interesting. It's a sci-fi where these people have gotten stranded on this planet that has been seeded with Earth life, basically, and has kind of gone out of control, but they've got stranded there, and they're 40 generations in, and they're pretty much cavemen of sorts, because all this stuff is huge. It's grown up huge. Like the mushrooms are like trees and all this stuff on this planet. So they're trying to figure out how to advance themselves there. So that's completely different from Prisoner of Zenda. But that was the first in my yearly book challenge. And this one, like I said, once again, Roger's Cheap Old Book Club.